Well, I have to ask you about another big part of your life, which was being in the pop music world as a member, or rock music world as a member of Blondie. And I guess maybe that also contributed to your work now as a writer. Also, maybe you were able to synthesize some things you learned from that
Hmm.
time in your life. Also, and I know that some of the books you've written have been about sort of the marriage of philosophy and pop culture or rock music. So
Hmm.
tell
Hmm.
us a little bit about that time in your life. It's really fascinating to me, at least.
Well, I mean, I first became interested in all the sorts of things have written about now for many years during that time when I was first playing in Blondie. This is like before Blondie became anything. A few years before they became very famous. This would have been, well, around this time of year, early spring in 1975, so almost 50 years ago. Yeah, I had wound up playing with them because, well, I was living in New York at the time. And well, I was never really a musician. I had delusions of being a poet, and I was writing a lot of very, very bad poetry. I wasn't going out of my way to make it bad. It just, it just was.
I can relate to that.
Well, there you go. But someone I knew from New Jersey. I mean, I was living in New York at the time in the East Village, and someone I knew from New Jersey went to playing drums with again. This is before Blondie. They were nobody at the time, and then they lost their bass player, and I could kind of, sort of, almost maybe play, but that was what was needed at the time, and so I wound up going and jamming with them, and I wound up playing with them, and this would have been, yes, at night, this time, early April 1975, and so I was in Blondie up until sort of the late summer of '77, and in the early days, the CBGB days. But we all lived together in, well, Chris Stein, Debbie Harry, and myself. We lived in this loft space on the Bowery. It was very, as you imagine, it was like bohemian, squalor at its most glamorous. And I had no interest in anything about the occult aside from weird fiction like H.P. Lovecraft. And I was a big Weird Tales, fan of all that sort of thing, or horror movies from the '40s, like the Frankenstein series or the Dracula, the Wolfman sort of thing. There's Universal horror films. But no, I was never really interested. I read a lot. I was, reading Hesse, and I was reading Sartre and existentialism, Nietzsche, and all this kind of stuff. But I wasn't really interested in the occult. But a book I came across at the time really knocked me out, and it was by this British writer I mentioned already named Colin Wilson, and he wrote a book called The Occult that came out in the early '70s. I came across it in '75, and what was fascinating about it is that he approached the occult with all from a philosophical perspective. So it wasn't just a book of spells or ghost stories or stuff like that. I didn't know. I mean, I only later I discovered about him that he, wrote books about existentialism and phenomenology and things like that. And I didn't even know what I knew what existentialism was, but I didn't know what phenomenology was at this time. And but I was fascinated, and it was a page turner. I mean, you said before it was easy to read my book. Well, and any capacity I have for writing like that comes from reading and rereading his books, obsessively over the years. And he has this wonderful, wonderful fluid style, where at the same time he's dealing with these very, very exciting, vital, deep, profound questions about, freedom and purpose and consciousness and all of this sort of stuff, and hidden powers. And there I am, all of 19, thinking, yeah, I'm all into that kind of thing. And so that was another transformative moment. In terms of what I'm doing now, was coming across that book. I mean, that book literally changed my life. I would not be who I am now, here sitting in London talking to you, had I not come across that book. Most likely. And this was at a time when I was playing and writing music. I wasn't writing anything. The music just came out. I mean, the songs just started to come out of me at the time. So there was the girl groups, then the British Invasion, the Beatles, and then all the other Brit groups, the Zombies, and the Animals, and the Herman's Hermits, and the Kinks, and all these, and then Motown. And then there was sort of the San Francisco sound. And so it was all these, great, and this was AM radio. So it was all these great 2-minute, songs. And I grew up listening to that on AM radio. And I wasn't a musician, but that came out when I became a musician for a while. And so I wound up, playing bass in Blondie, but I played guitar and I wrote a couple songs. And one song, Ex Offender, was the first, that was their, break. That was the song where they got their first record deal, and that later, the 45, and then that later led to the first Blondie album. But more to the point of what I'm doing now is a song that I wrote called "I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear," and this was about telepathic and sort of shared dream experiences I was having with my girlfriend at the time. And when I was on the first Blondie tour, and things like we would try to call each other at the same time. And again, this is much before mobile phones or any cell phones or anything like that. So, you had a phone booth, you're in a hotel room or something like that. And then it turned out we had same sorts of dreams. And so I wrote the song about that. So it became a big hit in the UK. It's like, I think one of the only songs in the top 10 has the word theosophy in its title, in its lyrics.
You said you didn't write the songs, they just came out, and you weren't really a musician, you just played. Can you explain to someone who maybe is more in the world of reality what you mean by that? Are you able to put words to that? Because I know what you mean by that, but many people would think, what in the world is he talking about?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I mean by saying I wasn't a musician was that when I was growing up and I was a teenager in Jersey, I had friends who were all great musicians. I mean, the drummer in Blondie, he was from Jersey. I used to see him play in bands. That's how I got into Blondie. Because I knew him, Clem Burke. I knew him from Bayonne. He played in bands in Bayonne, and used to go see him play and hang out with him and all these other people. And they were all like really, really good musicians. I mean, in the sense where like they would like figure out a Jimi Hendrix lick or an Eric Clapton lick or something like that. And I by hanging out, I picked up a few chords and all that, but I wasn't really, part of these people, wasn't really part of that crew. But I picked up a lot from listening, as I said, to music when I was a kid, and then I listened to music a lot, and then. When the thing in New York was happening, it was all very simple. It was like it was simple, stripped down, 2 or 3 chords kind of thing, and I could play that sort of stuff. And I think in many ways, for a lot of the people I knew when I was growing up, their perfectionism, they were very, very, good at all that. I was in the right time at the right place, and when I was also like on the edge. I was like part of a small group who were into, at the time, nobody else were into people like David Bowie and the New York Dolls and Mott the Hoople, and this was, glam rock and glitter, and I was wearing makeup and all this kind of stuff, and everybody else was like into the Grateful Dead, or and it's fine, but we were these small band that were on the edge of this kind of thing that later became quite popular. Yeah, so when Clem started playing in New York and they lost their bass player, he said, "Why don't you just come and jam?" And I had already gone to some of their shows and helped, bring in the equipment and that kind of thing. And so I wound up, it was fine. So the rudimentary way in which I could play was enough at the time. And then I basically learned, more as I went along. And then what I meant was that I could do what I do even now. It's like, I could play my own songs really well, but I'm not like a great session musician, put it that way, but I could play my own things. And what it is I got something out of the guitar. So I learned enough chords, and I guess I had absorbed sort of melodies and chord structures and progressions from hearing all this music, that I started to write songs. And then they came out, and they were in that sort of style. They were sort of in this kind of 60s pop sort of style. So I mean that's what I mean. It was more. I mean that's what was happening at the time too. It wasn't I mean you're a musician in the sense that you could bang out a few chords, but you weren't these great fantastic you know muso. I mean one of the things I would say in interviews was that like by the early 70s you had to go to the Juilliard School of Music in order to play rock and roll. Like bands like Yes and well these are the prog rock bands, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, these big Wagnerian epics and that kind of thing. And incidentally, something that I've noticed, but I haven't seen this come up too much in the context talking about this, but even in the early 70s, there was a nostalgia for the roots of rock and roll. It was a group called Sha Na Na that did all the old doo-wop numbers. Then people like Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard and others had comeback careers in the early 70s. So, which was interesting because it was only about 15 years of nostalgia, for the roots of rock and roll. It was like an early nostalgia. So that was sort of in the air, and that's what was. I mean, punk, UK punk, was much more aggressively, screw all that old stuff. I mean, but the New York stuff actually was more. Well, they did homages to that period. So, but yeah, that was the context in which, so, I mean, I wrote lots of songs, and I a couple of songs of Blondie and, one was a big hit, and I had my own band and I wrote quite a lot of songs and I sang and I played guitar and all that. So I could do that, but it was like, this was a means for me to get expression. And then at a certain point, I think I had exhausted what I could do with that. And I as I say in this book, I wrote about this period, this memoir called New York Rocker, My Life in the Blank Generation. I just got too smart because I was reading too many books. So I got too smart for rock and roll. I couldn't, and I started listening to classical music, Mahler and Bruckner on a Walkman. I was like one of the first people in New York to have a Walkman. And my girlfriend was at the time was a model, and she brought one back from a shoot in Tokyo. And this was, I mean, literally I'm walking around and I had the headphones on. Nobody else has these things. And they're like, ooh, what's that? But I'm listening to Bruckner or Mahler or Sibelius. And this was like, this is, this was the bells are ringing for the end of my pop career. Because after listening to that, I just couldn't, I couldn't play it anymore.